I am Anna Seawold, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach, and on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, finding safety after trauma. This is what I call a classic authentic parenting episode. If you are a new listener, welcome. And if you are a regular listener, welcome back. It's a conversation about trauma, healing, dealing with grief, and staying on a path towards wholeness. All things that we love to cover on this show. My guest today is Brandi Sellers-Jackson. She's a storyteller, birth and postpartum doula, and the creator of Not So Private Parts. Initially created as a women's lifestyle blog, Not So Private Parts has evolved into a resource removing the shame and stigma surrounding women's issues. Brandi is the co-founder of Moms in Color, a Black mom collective centered around celebrating diversity in the motherhood space. She's also the senior manager of social media for Ergobaby, a leading brand in baby wearing and attachment parenting. Brandi has a book coming up in January of 2024, and I had the honor of reading an advanced copy of her book. It's called On Thriving, Harnessing Joy Through Life's Great Labors. I really enjoyed reading it, and I especially enjoyed speaking with her on the podcast. I must admit, I never tire of hearing inspiring narratives about trauma and recovery, showcasing the remarkable human qualities of resilience, strength, forgiveness, courage, and vulnerability. This episode brims with profound insights, valuable reminders, and a sense of hope. Let this serve as a gentle reminder that healing is attainable. It doesn't follow a straightforward path. It's not a final destination, but an ongoing journey, and we all possess an innate capacity for it. Please enjoy. So you have a lot of questions in the book that are I appreciate such reflective, insight-provoking questions when I'm reading a self-help book or a book about trauma. And one of them was, where have you felt most safe in your life? A place where you felt the safest? And I started thinking about that question because I never really thought about it in a deep way. And I was really surprised that I have not felt safe in a lot of places. Looking back throughout my life, childhood and, young adult, and it seems like in a lot of places I have just existed, but that sense of felt safety was missing. And so I came up with, where I felt safe. But I want to ask you that question, and I want to start with that because that's a big part of healing from trauma is finding that sense of safety, right?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So I think it's funny, I've had places where I felt safe. I think in childhood, it was my grandmother's house that I write about in the book. That was the place that I felt the most safe because I could just sleep. I could sleep and not feel fear of disturbance from that sleep with violence and abuse from my biological father towards my mom. So I would say my grandmother's house is where I felt the most safe. And even to this, I actually went to go visit her a few months ago, and it's instant. I immediately feel it when I see her, is safety. I feel safe in my home, my current home as an adult, but considering all that I've had to work through, even feeling safe in my home after trauma has been work because, it's like when you've experienced such trauma, even when you are safe, you have to remind yourself of the safety. And even that safety can feel like unsafe, in a weird way. So yeah, I would say my grandmother's house and then my current home.
Yeah, you're so right. Recently, I went to the theater and I was meeting a friend, and it was evening. Restaurants are filled with people. It's a beautiful, breezy fall evening. Everything is perfect in the world. And yet, here I'm standing and feeling unease and scared and unsafe. And that familiar feeling came. And the desire to flee, to run away, to not go to the theater, to not meet the friend immediately took over me. And there was nothing in the environment obvious to threaten me, but it came from somewhere. And because I have done a lot of work, I was able to stay present to that and coach myself through feeling the anxiety, the feelings, just absorbing the environment, what's pleasant, what's available, how safe I am. I live in a safe town. Nothing is happening around me. Look at these beautiful laughing people, the lights. People are going to the theater. I am, surrounded by people. I had to do that work, coaching myself to gain that sense of safety. It's so interesting, how we can feel unsafe even when things are safe.
Yes. Yes. And that I feel like is a huge part of the residue of trauma and the work that we have to do after, because even when you are in a place of safety, it's almost like that disruption of chaos can all of a sudden feel as if, whoa, this is different. This is new. I don't even know how to process this. This must be danger. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you talk about growing up with a lot of chaos and witnessing violence towards your mom as a kid. Could you talk about hiding the knives, the urge to hide the knives, and give a little background of your story?
Yeah. So I believe I was around, oh my goodness, I think, yeah, I was young. I was really, really young. We had just moved to Alabama from Connecticut. And my biological dad had always been abusive towards my mom since I could remember. There wasn't a time that he wasn't. And then I remember like it was yesterday. I remember, one day just almost like a light bulb came on, like, oh, I know how to keep people safe. I know how to keep all of the adults safe. I can hide all the knives. And that will keep them from hurting each other, or the inevitable. Because in my child heart, I immediately knew, I was like, one, this is dangerous. Someone is going to get hurt. Someone's going to get killed. Something's going to happen. And so to avoid that happening, how about I just hide everything that can cause that? And so I did. I hid all the knives under my bed. And that was my child way of keeping everyone safe.
Wow. Well, as a child, taking that responsibility, that enormous responsibility, craving that peace, wanting that sense of safety, and being that agent of peacemaking. It's so clever for a young child to do that, to be that resourceful, right? To say that I have some power, I can do this, and believe in that. How did that translate into adulthood, into, adult relationships, that wanting to save people or hiding things or being the peacemaker? Could you talk about those patterns in later in life?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't stop, Yeah, it was at 8 or 9, it was knives, but it didn't stop just because I became an adult. It didn't stop. I continue to feel as if I have to be one step ahead. I have to think about all the possible outcomes, all of the things that could go wrong, all of the things that could go left, and be ahead of that, circumvent that in some kind of way, figure out a way to troubleshoot it in case it goes wrong. And then also, too, going back to the thing of trauma, feeling as if, oh, things could go wrong, even though everything was okay. So it didn't stop. And as you know, that's exhausting. I also would find myself being the quote unquote adult in the room amongst adults. I would take on the role as, okay, everyone's safe, everyone's good. If there was ever like a disagreement with other adults, whether it was in a workspace or a co-working space or any kind of space where that felt like there was tension, even if it were positive or constructive tension, I would feel it and immediately be zapped back into childhood, feeling like I was in the middle, feeling like I have to circumvent whatever could be happening, whatever impending doom. And I would just immediately go into, being the adult amongst adults. So yeah, it didn't stop. It continued. And it took a lot of work for me to remember that I'm safe, that we are all adults here. No one's in danger. Yes, this might feel the same as when I was in childhood, but it's not. It's not the same.
It takes, yeah, you're right. It's so exhausting that it burns so much energy. It's like running in the background constantly. And, the brains of people who have experienced trauma are different, right? The size of the amygdala is larger, the memory center hippocampus is affected. And obviously, you're talking about hypervigilance, being a few steps ahead of things and doing all of those things. But when we are out of trauma now, it takes a lot of work to retrain ourselves to gain that safety. It's still a lot of work, right? To say, I am safe now. These are other adults. To recognize that you're not in the past anymore, right? That this is happening now and that was in the past. What have you found helpful in terms of, helping yourself in those moments when you're hypervigilant, when you fall into the old patterns of trauma, like as an adult now? What do you do?
Well, first I stop. And it's a little different from freezing, but I stop because my initial innate go-to whenever I feel in danger is to get busier. I start running, like I flee. That is my thing. I flee, and I don't necessarily like disappear. I don't do that, but I start getting busy. Like I start cleaning, or I start organizing, or I start doing things around the house, or I start doing things wherever I am. I just get busy and I start going into that hypervigilance, that let me fix it, let me take care of it, let me go. I got to do this. That's what I get into. So I have to first disrupt that pattern. I have to disrupt it, and I have to stop, and I have to look around me. I look around and I remind myself, you're safe. You're safe. And I sometimes, actually, I say it a lot. I will say it out loud. You're safe. You're safe. This is not happening again. Whatever this is, you're safe. And also, I believe in the power of touch. I will rub my arms. I'll hold my own hand. That power of like reminding myself that you're not in danger. You're not in danger. So that's what I usually do. I stop. I just stop. That for me has been helpful because my innate go-to is like go mode, activate now. And I have to remind myself that no, we're good. We're good. No one's in trouble. No one's in danger. Stop, pause, breathe. That's a big thing for me. I breathe because that's I think our first thing that we do is we stop breathing. When we're triggered and activated, we stop breathing. So for me, at least I do, I remember breathe, Brandy, breathe. You're okay. And immediately when I do that, when I take a deep breath in and I blow it out, it immediately centers me to like, okay, we're good. We're good. Everything's fine.
Yeah, thank you for that. You call, your biological father by his first name in the book. Could you take me back to that moment after your mom's funeral when you met your father after 20 years for the first time?
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't seen him since when they divorced. So I was like 10, about to be 11. And it was really weird because all of a sudden, I mean, here's this figure that's been larger than life for me. When you're 10 years old, 8 years old, 7 years old, 6 years old. Everyone is bigger than you. And seeing him in that moment as an almost 30 something at that time, this is years ago, it did a few things for me. One, I was able to see him as a person, not just as my biological dad, not just as this person that was, larger than life, scary, terrifying, and whose behavior had caused so much chaos. I was able to see him as a scared, traumatized boy. And, just to give context to his story, he grew up in a home where his biological mother would leave him for days as a baby, as a child. And it was, that as a mother now of 3 children, 3 boys, I immediately thought about, at that time, I only had one child. I only had my oldest, who's now going to be 17 next month. But at that time, he was a little kid. He was like 4, almost 5. And I remember just thinking what it would be like for him if I didn't love him in the way that he needed, or if I abandoned him, and what his life would be like, and how bad that would affect him, how much that would affect him. And immediately I felt this empathy and compassion, and not it as an excuse for his behavior, my biological father, but more so I was able to see the human, the hurt human, that had all of his actions were a result of that hurt. We hear that phrase, hurt people, but it was very clear to me in that moment. Oh, he's hurt. He's a hurting individual that, unfortunately, back then, in his day and age, there was no therapy really for, young Black boy growing up in, Jim Crow South. There was none of that. And so a lot of what he dealt with growing up, he self-medicated with, drugs and alcohol. He had a lot of anger and all of that. And that doesn't excuse it again, but I was able to see, oh, okay, this is a scared, hurt individual that is yet to heal. He's never been given the chance to heal, and he doesn't even know what to do. That's what that is. And so it was crazy. It was jarring because I hadn't seen him in so long. But at the same time, I was so grateful that I was able to see him because, oh my gosh, who knew that months later he would be gone, dying months later. So.
Yeah, in his home, there was fire, right?
Yeah, there was a fire. And yeah, and it's interesting because I always think about, if that hadn't have happened, would I have not rekindled, but reconnected? And the answer is I don't think I would have, but who knows? We didn't get that chance. But, I was glad, I was grateful. I was so grateful that I was able to see him and to even say, I love you. Because I think for people like that, you know what you know, and he knew what he knew.
I'm surprised that he came to your mother's funeral.
I was too. I was, but then again, I wasn't. Yeah, I was torn because there was a part of me that was very surprised that he even showed his face, knowing the history, and everyone knew the history. But at the same time, I really don't think he was so disconnected from himself and his emotions and all that I don't even think he realized how inappropriate that might have been. So it's really, really sad.
Yeah. Let's talk about, it's getting darker and darker. Let's talk about grief and what we can learn from grief.
Yeah.
I think I also like the part where you talk about self-intimacy, building self-intimacy. And I love the choice of words that you have, and self-sanctuary. I want to come back to that too. But since we talked about the funeral and the death of both of your parents, let's talk about grief. As a teacher, what did you learn about grief? How you processed your own grief? You also talk about anger in that chapter. So talk to me, dormancy in grief. It's so beautiful. Where do you want to start in talking about grief?
Well, I feel like the grief portion of the book it was the hardest part to write. However, it's probably what I'm most proud of because I really wanted to create a space where we can, one, normalize it. There are a lot of grieving people, a lot of grief everywhere, and we all get a seat in that space. All of us, we're not exempt from it. We will all grieve at some point. More than likely, someone is grieving now, you know? And so I really wanted to write a section of the book that normalized it, that gave us hope that it is not the end of a thing, but the beginning of another. And yeah, I just wanted to normalize it a little bit where it's not so taboo. It's not something that you have to hide in your cubby about. And so I start off the section with the story of my mom, and then the story of my dad grieving the childhood that I wish that I had, but I didn't. And then also, too, the grief that we experience when we achieve the things that we want. You know, grief is not always tied to bad things. Sometimes there is grief when there is good. You know, you're grieving the loss of, you get a promotion, you're grieving the loss of the time that you had before. You have a new baby. I wanted to talk about postpartum grief, and not just postpartum in the sense of kids, but when you birth something that you've wanted forever, but you have to grieve the after effects of it. You have a baby and you have to grieve, oh my gosh, the sleep that you no longer have and will not have for a very, very, very long time. Unless you have a really great child that just loves to sleep, which I am not. I don't know that child. I've had 3. I don't know that child. Or, you birth that business that you've always wanted, and you have to grieve the loss of free time that you've had. So I really wanted to normalize it. I wanted to put a different face to it and make it a little bit easier for us to kind of digest and metabolize.
Looking back at your life, what would you say was the first time that you lost something, that you had to grieve? At what age? What was it? Do you remember when you were conscious of loss for the first time?
Yeah. I mean, the first person that I had to really grieve, or a thing that I had to grieve, was my mother. She passed away when I was like 2 weeks before going into my 30th year on earth. And I had to grieve her. And I, for some reason, thought that because her and I had such a great relationship, that I would somehow be exempt from that grief, that because there was no unfinished business or no whatever, that I would somehow be okay with it. And I wasn't. I think if anything, it made it worse. The heartache of it made the heartache of it worse. And so, yeah, she was the first person that I really had to grieve and sit with, that, wow, this person is no longer here. Now, what do I do? How do I feel? How do I continue on? And what does that look like?
I feel like this idea that I have, I'm not sure if it's right or wrong, but I feel like it rings true to me. So I'm going to share with you. I feel like in childhood, if we experience grief, the first time we experience a loss the first time ever, whenever that is, I think, and how that first loss is handled and processed or not processed sort of determines our signature for loss and grief for the future. I think it's not a blueprint, but it has a lot to do in how resilient, adapt, or how you would process other losses. As you mentioned, there are so many in our life, right? And I'm often reminded of this in my work with couples who are going through divorce. And so divorce is also, dissolution of a marriage, a relationship, the hopes and dreams that people had. Divorce comes with a lot of loss of the memories, loss of the life together, loss of what may never be, like a lot. So for the first time, I notice in my clients that this divorce provokes a huge, huge reaction, because this is the first time they experience loss in a big way. And because they don't have quote unquote practice earlier in their life, they're not prepared to handle it well. It's life shattering for a lot of people. But what I also know is people who I see have had losses along the way in their childhood, be that a pet or a grandmother, not necessarily a person, but a loss of some sort. It could be, something that a child experienced as a loss consciously. That's what I mean, because you may have experienced a lot of losses when you were a kid and it didn't register as a loss. But the first conscious loss that you were aware of, how did your parents or how the other adults around you approach it, help you, support you, handle it? I think it sort of sets the stage for how you handle losses in the future.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, it's interesting because it's like when you're in fight or flight mode, I don't think you have a chance to even process things. They just kind of come and you just kind of move through them however. And I think that was my story for a while during childhood, all of my childhood for the most part, to the point where if I look back, yeah, I'm like, oh yeah, that was a loss. That was definitely a loss. But back then, I didn't even see it as that because I just had to just move through. I had to move through it and keep it moving. So, yeah.
But the impact lives in our body, right? It stays with us. And so when you experience grief later in life and in which you are more conscious and you allow yourself to grieve, it all just comes out, all of that stuff. How was the grief that you experienced after your mother's loss? I want to know how different it was after, your father's death.
That it's interesting because I thought, and this might have been super naive of me, but I think with my father's death, I thought because we were estranged for so long, I thought not that I wouldn't feel anything, but that there would be no grief, possibly. And that might sound really naive. I just thought there wouldn't be any grief. There wouldn't be, because I hadn't seen him in so long. So what's the difference, right? But I think now I realize that it's not even about time necessarily or distance. It's the fact that it's gone. It's gone. And that is the part that has to grieve. Like I knew that even though I hadn't seen him in so long, he was still here. He was still here on earth. So I think it's the actual finality of it. That is the part that I had to grieve. And I thought it would be different. Like I knew with my mom, yeah, okay. Once I started the grieving process, like, okay, that makes sense. But then there was a whole different other part of grief that I had to do with my biological dad. And that looked different. It did. It looked very different. It wasn't the same kind of grief, but it was still there. It looked different in the sense of, yeah, there were tears. There were a lot of tears. The thing that I cried for was different. I missed my mother. With my father, I missed what could have been. I missed that the childhood could have been different. Our interaction could have been different. Our relationship could have been different. Why wasn't it different? Why couldn't he have just been X, Y, and Z? It was different, but it was still there. So I grieved what I wished it could have been, versus with my mother, I grieved what was, if that makes sense.
Of course it does. Yeah, it's so resonant for me too. I lost my father 2 years ago and I lost my mom when I was 13. So there is a huge difference. I always think about this, how it's so different. Like with my dad, I miss him every day. You miss the presence of that person, the memories. You miss the presence. With my mom, it's the absence that is more influential on me. That what could have been, I didn't have that. I grieved the absence. With my father, I grieved the presence, his presence. It sounds like you're talking about the same thing.
Exactly.
It's still grief, but very, very different. I want to go back for a moment to that story where you met your dad at the funeral. What was it in you that made you see him differently? Was it the fact that you became a mom, and so this innocent child of yours, and so that connection with your dad, something moved in you. Have you already done some kind of personal development, trauma work? What was it? Or maybe it's not one thing, but I'm curious about your thoughts. What was it that made you see him, his humanity?
I think for me, it was a couple of things, but I think the most prominent being I became a parent and I became a mother. And it's interesting because the moment that I became a mother with my oldest, I immediately started feeling all the things about my childhood, my own childhood. I started feeling all these feelings about, how my parents handled a lot of things, from me being molested as an adolescent to how I was raised to all the things. And then when it came to my biological dad, it kind of broke me open in a way to where I had this, this little human who all of a sudden needed me for everything, wanted me for everything. I was his favorite person. I mean, his dad is also his favorite, but as a baby, I am his favorite person in the world. And I could only think about if I were the kind of mother or parent that showed the behaviors that my biological dad experienced at that age and how that would affect them. And that for me, it just broke me open in a way that was just like, whoa, wait, there's an opportunity to see him not just as my parent, but as a human being, as a former child, as someone who has significant wounds and has yet to mend them or had even opportunity to mend them. So I think it was me becoming a mother, and I don't know why that is. I mean, I guess I could see why that is, but it was something about giving birth to something that loved me in such a way, and me possibly not demonstrating that love back, and how that would break anyone.
The reason I'm asking is there are a lot of people, and some among my listeners, we have a support call and we have discussed this topic in our support calls, how, one can know consciously that by understanding and, our parents' stories can help us generate more compassion towards them and empathy, and that can change and we can generate forgiveness. A lot of people know this, but they have a big resentment because of the hurt that they endured in the hands of that adult, of that parent. They are still looking for maybe something from the parent. I don't know, but we've talked about this, and one listener came to mind. That's why I asked that question. It's not that easy for a child to do that for their parent, especially the parent who caused so much damage and violence and fear and trauma. It's not an easy task. I just want to recognize that. And what could you say to that person? I mean, it seems like this came to you more organically, or did you do any work towards it consciously, or all the work that you have done led to that? What would you say to the person who is finding it hard in their heart to see their parents' humanness and their trauma and connect to that woundedness of their parent as a child? What do you have any words of wisdom for that person?
I would say that it's not your fault. How they loved you, how they showed up for you, how they didn't show up for you, how they didn't protect you, even how perhaps it felt as if they didn't love you. It's not your fault. It has nothing to do with you and your magic and who you are as the wonderful person you are. It's not you. It is all them. I write in the book where I say, for me, I wanted to blame. That was a big thing for me. I wanted to blame. I wanted to blame my father for not being the father that I needed him to be. But then when I sat with it, I said, I would have to blame him, but then I would have to blame the person who made him. And then the person before that, until I ran out of faces and names that I even knew. And I think we have to do that. We have to go back and kind of allow ourselves to do it, like allow ourselves to go through the blame, like blame game. Okay, I blame you. Okay, well, now you got to blame the person before that and the person before that until you run out, until you touch, I say slavery, until you touch the Holocaust, until you touch this, until you touch that, until you just run out of, people. Because if you begin to do that, you can kind of begin to see that these people that we call parents are just people who made people, who made people, who made us. That's all they are. And that's where we can find some compassion that they have their own trauma, their own journey, their unhealed wounds that they maybe tried, some of them not so much. Some of them are so in denial and don't see, they're like, what wound? And that's just the reality of it. And yeah, I would say it's not you. It's not you. It's not your fault. You are everything. You are wonderful. You are magical. You are everything that is beautiful in this world. It's not you. It's not you.
I'm so glad you talked about blame, because when you first started saying, opening this paragraph, you said there is no place to blame or something. I'm like, no, wait. I want the person to blame the other person, at least in fantasy, at least for a while, because there's room for that too. We can't all just be hippie and forgiving. And no, there is room for that blame. And I'm very glad you mentioned it. But there is an end to it, and there is grieving. After that blame, now it's your responsibility, or whatever you want to call it. Now it's on you. You have to cry. You have to grieve. You have to grieve. That's the best way that I can say. And until you're ready for that, and it's a hard thing, right? There is no roadmap to say, now go blame 100 people in your lineage and then grieve for 2 days, then you'll be done.
No.
It may take a lifetime for you just to even have the courage to blame everyone or to even open up to grief. But I want people to know that there is no right or wrong. We're just all doing our best on this healing path towards wholeness. There's no script or roadmap. What was it for you? It may look differently for another person, but normalize that. Hey, if you're blaming your parent and their parent, that's fine too.
Yes, absolutely. It's important. I think for me, it helped. It helped to just go through the list. It really helped me because I think in some ways I didn't want to, there's a part of me that was like, well, I don't want to do that. But it helped me to just go back as far as I could, because for me, it allowed me just to see the full picture, the full picture, almost like laid out, like, okay, and then this is connected to this, and then that, and that. It helped. And then, like you said, there is a grieving process behind that. It isn't like you can just be like, okay, and that's it. No. And I feel like it's life work. It's life work because it didn't, in some ways, some people I'm like, yeah, that's still not okay. And it's not, and even with my biological dad, like I said, I don't think I would have ever reconnected with him because it's just so much there. But it helped me to kind of see the full picture and the full gamut of what was really going on here, that it had nothing to do with me. Because that's the thing I think a lot of people struggle with. They wonder, why wasn't I lovable enough? Why wasn't I enough? And for me doing that, it helped me to take the focus off of something that I did wrong or that it was me, and it wasn't. It's not, it has nothing to do with you,
So let me ask you something, that the violence that your father exhibited towards your mom, how did that impact your mom, her perception of herself, of her womanhood, of her personhood? Am I lovable? Am I enough? How do you think that impacted her?
I think, it's interesting. My mom, although she was going through, although she was being battered and abused, she had this light about her that still was really bright. I still to this day don't know how. I don't know how. I don't understand it. I don't know how. Where if you saw her, you would never know. You would never know. I think, though, that it stripped her of her feeling as if she were as strong as she actually was. It took her forever to leave. It took her a really long time for her to leave. And I think the longer that she stayed, the longer it stripped her from her innate power. And it wasn't until I was 11 years old, 10, 11, that she immediately felt like, okay, I can do this. It took a really long time. So I think it stripped her from her seeing herself the way everyone in this world saw her.
Is there something you want to leave my listeners with? A message, a quote, a passage from your book, a question for them to reflect on? As I said, the book has so many beautiful questions. There's the 3 questions, and there was a question that you asked a client of yours. What do you need within this moment? I think that's a beautiful question too.
Yeah, I personally love that question. And I ask myself that every single day. What do you need in this moment? And I think that's an important question because we don't ask ourselves that question often enough. I think a lot of times we expect for our needs to be automatically met because we're human and that's what we do. We expect that. We need them to be met. And I think that question takes back our power, that we are our own savior. We are our own source for thriving. We are our own energy when it comes to that, and that it's up to us to give ourselves the things that we need, especially when it comes to different titles that we have, whether it's work, whatever. Like, we are the person that's going to give us what we need. And we are the ones that are going to be able to communicate what it is that we need if we can't give it to ourselves. So I personally love that question. I ask myself that all the time when I'm feeling anxious, when I'm feeling not anxious. What is it that I need? Oh, I need food. Oh, I need water. Oh, because we can just go. We just get in our zone and we're just going. And we just take care of everyone else's needs and we forsake our own. And I don't think it's not sustainable and it doesn't support our thriving. So I love that question. What is it that you need?
And what is it that you need in this very moment, Brandy?
I need a good vacation. I want to go either to some small village in Europe and eat copious amounts of bread. That's what I need. I need that. I need bread and more bread and just a really good vacation and a good book.
That sounds good. Well, I hope you get it. I hope you. And tell the listener, how many plants do you have?
Well, I have 45 plants in my home. However, when we moved to Pasadena, I had to kind of start over because plants, they don't really like moving a lot. They don't like sudden changes. They're not a fan of that. So I've had to nurse many of them back to health. Some of them I've had to be like, okay, this is goodbye. But I've had to restart in many ways when it comes to my parenthood. Moving.
I love that. I should have counted my plants to see if I have as many as you do, but I do have many. And you're right. There's symbolism in that, right? Plants don't like move or change. Who does, right? And you can see some people weather the change very well, just like plants, and some don't. And that's very symbolic. Thank you so much. Good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And may you always thrive and find safety within yourself and give it to others, the mothers that you work with as a doula.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm so honored and excited to have shared today.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. I love hearing from you. I welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. If you want to connect with your fellow listeners from around the world, engage in meaningful conversations about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for people like you. If you enjoy the podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. Also, this show is an ad-free podcast, and support for the podcast comes from listeners like you. You can make a one-time or an ongoing donation through my website at authenticparenting.com/support. Your contribution makes a difference. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and elsewhere. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Siewold. Thank you so much for listening.